Well, hello there, class. I wanted to talk to you a little bit here on this Friday morning. It's late morning now here where I am. I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the Deuteronomic history, and in particular, this theme of ambiguity within the DH, as I'll call it here, by way of abbreviation. So, where do we see this ambiguity? We've been talking about this for a few days now, and I want to maybe reinforce some of the things that you are seeing and also point out some things that you haven't seen yet. Okay, so let's first look at this idea of the Davidic covenant to begin with. Now, the term covenant is never used in this text, but in 2 Samuel 7:14, you see that there is this idea of an eternal grant covenant by God to David, ultimately to last forever, for an eternal dynasty. Okay, and we can see that here in the text here. It says, this is 2 Samuel 7:14. I will be a father to him, God speaking here, he shall be a son to me, and if he does wrong, now this is the interesting part of it, I will correct him with the rod of men and human chastisements. However, I will not withdraw my favor from him as I withdrew it from his predecessor Saul, whom I removed from my presence. Verse 16, you and your kingdom shall endure forever before me. Your throne shall stand firm forever. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there in this text. Why? Because this chastisement clause brings open the possibility of, well, can bad things happen to this kingdom, in the course of its eternal dynasty, and how bad can these things actually get? So is this a true grant covenant or not? Or is God's commitment to the throne really in some way, after all, contingent upon how David and his successors behave? And of course, when you jump ahead to the very end of the story, the tragic end of the story, after the horrible act of the latter kings in offering their own children as sacrifices, you can see this in chapter 2 Kings 24. You can see what the text says here. And of course, they're very well aware of this eternal promise. And so what they're doing now is explaining how the destruction of the kingdom still happened despite this eternal promise, this eternal grant covenant on the part of God. And this is during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. This is right before the exile. Verse 2, the Lord turned loose against Jehoiakim, that's the second to last king of Judah, the band of Chaldeans and others, and he loosed them against Judah to destroy it, as the Lord had threatened through his servants the prophets. This befell Judah because the Lord had stated that he would inexorably put them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh. That's that child sacrifice thing I was talking to you about. And especially because of the innocent blood he shed, with which he filled Jerusalem, the Lord would not forgive. So there's this ambiguity here. Is this an eternal promise or not? Well, the prophets in some way have to kind of work out this ambiguity. How can this eternal promise be consistent with the monarchy actually following? So that's one major ambiguity there in the Deuteronomic history, that the prophets in some sense, and really ultimately the New Testament, in the way it fulfills the prophets, must work out. Okay, so now many of you are seeing also that the text indicates that there was reluctance on the part of Yahweh and the high priest Samuel to establish the monarchy to begin with. Okay, Samuel tried his best. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 8. You should read that if you haven't already. Samuel tries his best to talk Israel out of getting a king. It's going to lead to all of these problems. In fact, all of the things that Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, warned against on the part of future kings, Samuel predicts will in fact happen if in fact Israel goes the distance and has a king. And indeed, one of the things Samuel adds to this is the fear of oppressive taxation. And that's no small matter, because that actually is the thing that causes the kingdom to fragment in the first place. How Israel became two kingdoms, of Judah in the south, Israel in the north. the 10 tribes of the north, breaking away from the whole integrity of the Davidic kingdom because of the oppressive taxation under Solomon's son Rehoboam, following the lead of Jeroboam, who becomes, the pattern of from the point of view of the Deuteronomic historian, the wicked and idolatrous kings in the north. Okay, so this is interesting then, and indeed, every single one of the kings of Judah are sort of put at the template of David. In other words, David is kind of put as an ideal, not entirely a convincing ideal, as we'll see. He's a very ambiguous figure himself, and I think I'll make another video here in a moment to explain to you why that's the case, and pointing out to you some things you haven't seen. But nevertheless, in the northern kingdom, if you look at the write-up for each of the kings there, even the ones that the southern writers admit do some good things, you can see that they write in such a way that there's really just no basic way that they can escape from the template of Jeroboam the first. In other words, they're all like Jeroboam the first in that they follow along with his unforgivable sort of original sin of breaking away from the Davidic dynasty to begin with. Okay, but indeed, one thing I do want to point out at this stage is that the Deuteronomic historian, and there's probably not just one person here, by the way, there's probably many of them, but whoever sort of put all this together in the form that we have it, is aware of the ambiguity of David, and indeed, he seems to almost flirt with making Josiah, the great reformer, who operated, around several decades before the exile, and in fact, Judah's last hope to clean up its act. He was so good, in fact, that the Deuteronomic historian seems to flirt with making him the standard bearer rather than David. And I want to point this out to you as well. This is in 2 Kings 23, 24, and 25. It says further, and this is what Josiah did. Josiah did away with the consultation of ghosts and spirits, with the household gods and idols and all the other horrors to be seen in the land of Judah and Jerusalem, so that he might carry out the stipulations of the law written in the book that the priest Hilkiah had found in the temple of the Lord. So you see here, he's really the only king thus far who not only takes out the high places completely, and all the other sort of idolatry that flows from that, but he's also the only one really who fully takes seriously the Deuteronomic law to begin with, and especially the anti-idolatry thrust of that law. Idolatry was really one of the main things, in fact, that the Deuteronomic law was legislating against. So. But look what it says here afterwards. Before him, and this is talking about Josiah here, this is verse 25 of 2 Kings 24, before him there had been no king who turned to the Lord as he did, with his whole heart, his whole soul, and his whole strength. That heart, soul, strength is, of course, language taken from Deuteronomy 6. We've looked at this before. This is from the famous Shema prayer. Hear, O Israel, love the Lord your God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. So in other words, he's perfectly fulfilling the Deuteronomic law. It's almost as though he would have been a much better template figure than David. And he goes on to say here, nor could anyone after compare with him. No one's better before him, no one's better after him. But what happens? Well, it's Deuteronomy, right? So there can't really be success that comes from this. And of course, a few verses later, we see that Josiah is dead, having been killed untimely, in an untimely way, on the plains of Moab. And so ultimately all his reforms come for naught. So this is again another ambiguity in the depiction of the kingdom. David is sort of in a way forced to be the template figure because he's the one to whom the promise of the eternal dynasty is given. However, Josiah is in some way the man really much closer to the mind of the Deuteronomics historian. The DH's idea of a king is really much closer to Josiah than it had been to David. Okay, so what are some other things, ambiguities in this? Well, this is something I don't think any of you have noted yet. the monarchy is understandable, right? The ambivalence there, because always human kings are going to have moral failings, right? And anytime you have a human king who's charged with governing the people of God, there's going to be limitations. I mean, in some ways, we have that problem today. We've got popes and who in their own way act as human governors of the people of God, and they're always imperfect. So we have this problem today in a way. We sort of build them off the temple of Peter, and yet we also know in our heart that Peter himself had plenty of moral failings as well. So this is obviously something we'd expect on some level. However, there's even ambiguity about the temple itself. This is interesting too. The Deuteronomic historian, the DH, is less pro-temple than we would expect, given the fact that its authors are all men who work in the temple, who are in effect part of the temple system, are employed by the temple as prophets. That is, prophets, in the context here, are ultimately chief historians. They're the ones charged with chronicling the kingdom's history, and they're the ones who written and preserve these texts for us. There is indeed, the old Sinclair Lewis has a joke that corporate corruption is, a man will never be able to see corruption if his salary depends on him not seeing it. Indeed, this is very, very much true. So the Deuteronomic historian here is dead set against any other sorts of religious rivals or cults in the first place. They have no problem seeing the corruption, however. They don't like the Asherah poles, the high places, the mediums, the sorcerers, but nevertheless, they all portray, the DH portrays Yahweh himself as being really ambivalent about the temple project in the beginning. Remember how the temple project came about. This is in 2 Samuel 7. This is right before David gets his covenant promise from God. David gets a dream, and the prophet Nathan, David gets a dream to build a temple, and the prophet Nathan says, hey, do it, it's great idea, go ahead and go for it. And then, of course, thinks about it some more, and then God says to him, well, thanks, but no thanks. I really don't need a temple. I'm perfectly happy here. I never asked for a temple. I'm perfectly happy being shuffled around from place to place in this tabernacle. Come again. Actually, you know what? I think I will take the temple after all, but you're not going to be the one to build it, but rather it will be your son Solomon. So, it's a little like John Kerry. He was for the temple before he was against it, and then he came around to accepting it. And so, indeed, now many scholars will look at this and see that, well, there's two different sources here. There's a pro-temple source and there's an anti-temple source. I don't really buy that interpretation myself. I think that there's deliberate ambiguity in the original source, and that's because the temple itself is clouded in some ways, because not only it's connected with David, but we'll see there's a couple other things here as well. Now you can see, how does the temple begin? It's very auspicious in the beginning, okay, in the first part of it. In 1 Kings 8, there's an attempt in the text with the glory cloud. This is in 1 Kings 8, verse 8, chapter 8, verse 9 through 14. There's this glory cloud and the great blessing to have Solomon. He's giving, well, really, in a way, he's imitating this great glory cloud that happened in Horeb in Deuteronomy. In other words, so the text wants us to see that not only is this an awesome project that God is blessing, but there's some continuity between how God communicated originally to the people through Moses in the tabernacle, and now, well, first originally in the mountain and then through the tabernacle, but now this idea is being continued in the temple, so that there's continuity here, that indeed this is not new worship, but this is now in perfect continuity with how God's been dealing with his people all along. Okay, so that's pretty neat. But if you go back and look closely in 1 Kings 3, this is in 1 Kings 3, 1 through 4, this is at Gibeon. Solomon asked for wisdom here. Let's take a look at this real quick. So with royal power firmly in his grasp, Solomon allied with himself by marriage to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The daughter of Pharaoh whom he married, he brought to the city of David, until he should finish building his palace, and until the temple of the Lord, and the temple of the Lord, and the wall around Jerusalem. However, this is key, the people were sacrificing on the high places, for up to that time no temple had been built to the name of the Lord. Solomon loved the Lord and obeyed the statutes of his father David, yet he offered sacrifice and burned incense on the high places. Well, that's not sounding too good, is it? Let's read on here. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there because that was the most renowned high place. Now we already know, looking ahead in the story, how the DH thinks of the high places. The high places are horrible. That's the one thing that none of the kings of Judah are able to resolve, except for Josiah, and we saw that he only could resolve it very, very briefly. So what happens? Well, in the Gibeon, this is after Solomon's offer. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "Ask something of me, and I will give it to you." And Solomon answers and asked for wisdom. Okay, which is great. The Lord was very, very much pleased by this effect. Okay. By this request. Yeah, sorry about that, class. I had a little technical problem there, but I wanted to finish here briefly just talking about the ambiguity in the temple. And what I wanted to point out to you was this passage is famous because Solomon, this is in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. This passage is famous because Solomon asked for wisdom, and that's obviously one of the great things about Solomon is rather than gold and riches and power and money and all the rest, he asked for wisdom. He's justly famous and rightly famous for this, but this is key. Notice here that how this is portrayed. This is also before the beginning of the temple construction project. All the people here we're being told are sacrificing at high places because there's no temple yet. They're sacrificing in high places because there's no temple yet. Now, the sacrifices at high places are themselves an abomination, right? The text makes clear of that afterwards. Now, obviously, if they had wanted to do this the right way, the author of the text, the DH, surely are aware that they could have made a central sanctuary out of a tent, okay, and had gone along doing it that way if they were to comply with the Deuteronomic law more strictly, okay? So I want to get you to see here that this is very subtle, but the entire temple project is in some way presented in this point, even before it's built, as a means of channeling the idolatrous impulses of the king and the people. Its construction does not indeed spring from a pure devotion to God. It's not because David or Solomon loved the Lord with all their heart, all their soul, all their strength. It's clouded with this sort of idea of impurity and ambiguity to begin with. Yeah, it's going to be a great house. God wasn't sure that he wanted it originally. He really sort of maybe would have preferred not to have it, but he said, okay, well, let's go ahead and do it. So you see here again, there's this ambiguity here around the central institutions here of king and temple. Okay, well, we'll stop there and I'll come back in a minute and talk to you about more ambiguities in the Deuteronomic history and how, by the way, this compares with something I did not assign for you this week, but nevertheless, if you have time, you should check out, and that's the chronistic history. That's the book of Chronicles. Okay.